A U.S. passenger plane vanished without a crash, without a trace. 10 years later, it suddenly landed perfectly on an American runway. Rescue teams rushed in, only to find every passenger and crew reduced to skeletons in their seats. The families were never told what really happened. And what authorities hid next will change everything. Before you watch another true crime story, ask yourself this. What if a plane disappeared from the American sky, and no one ever found it? No wreckage, no emergency signal, no final message, just silence. Now imagine this. 10 years later, that same aircraft suddenly appears on radar again, approaching a U.S. runway as if nothing ever happened. The landing is perfect. The pilots follow procedure. The wheels touch down smoothly. Rescue crews rush toward the plane expecting survivors. But when the doors open, every single person on board is dead. Not injured. Not frozen. Skeletons. Still strapped into their seats. Tonight, you're about to uncover one of the most disturbing aviation mysteries ever linked to the United States, a case built on one small mistake, a chain of ignored warnings, and a truth that authorities quietly buried. Stay with me until the end, because what investigators discovered inside the cockpit rewrites everything you think you know about this flight. And before we dive in, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications right now. Because stories like this are disappearing faster than the evidence. On the morning of May 14, 2013, Horizon Air Flight 417 departed from Charleston, South Carolina, bound for Seattle, Washington. The aircraft was a mid-range commercial jet carrying 138 passengers and 6 crew members. Families. Business travelers. A school counselor escorting a group of teens back home. Nothing about the flight appeared unusual. Captain Derek Mallory, a veteran pilot with over 17,000 flight hours, handled the departure alongside his first officer, Rachel Hinton. Both had clean records. Both had flown this route before. At exactly 9:18 a.m., the aircraft climbed smoothly into cruising altitude. For the first hour, communication with air traffic control was completely normal. Then, at 10:27 a.m., something small happened. A routine navigation update was entered into the flight management system. Just one line of data. One correction. One keystroke. Seconds later, Flight 417 drifted 3 miles off its assigned airway. Air traffic control attempted to correct the deviation. No response. The transponder signal flickered. And without any distress call, Horizon Air Flight 417 vanished from American airspace. Not crashed. Not tracked. Simply erased. Within 6 minutes of losing contact with Horizon Air Flight 417, the Federal Aviation Administration issued a nationwide alert. Radar data showed the aircraft's last known position above a wide stretch of rural Missouri farmland, flat terrain, scattered woods, and abandoned rail lines cutting through miles of empty land. It should have been easy to find. Instead, it became one of the most expensive and confusing aviation searches in U.S. history. The Air Force deployed reconnaissance aircraft. The National Guard launched helicopters. Local sheriff departments combed rivers, fields, and private properties. Even amateur drone operators were recruited to assist. Nothing turned up. No debris. No smoke trails. No emergency locator transmitter. The signal simply ended, as if the aircraft had dissolved into the sky. Investigators initially believed the jet had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure and plunged straight down. But after weeks of excavation across the projected impact zone, search teams uncovered nothing. Not a fragment of aluminum, not a scrap of luggage, not even a scorched patch of soil. Families were told to prepare for the worst. Privately, however, FAA analysts were facing an impossible problem. Radar showed no sudden descent. No spiral. No rapid loss of altitude. Flight 417 did not behave like a plane that crashed. It behaved like a plane that kept flying, and no one could explain where it went. 3 weeks after Horizon Air Flight 417 vanished, a quiet discovery changed the direction of the investigation. At an FAA Communications Review Center in Virginia, technician Marcus Doyle was rechecking archived radio traffic from the morning of the disappearance. His job was simple: listen for anything automated systems might have filtered out. That afternoon, buried inside a corrupted audio packet, he heard a voice. It lasted only 6 seconds. Navigation just dropped. Stand by. The voice was unmistakably human. And it wasn't a distress call. There was no panic. No shouting. Just confusion. More disturbing was the timestamp. The message had been transmitted 17 minutes after the official radar loss. According to all tracking systems, Flight 417 no longer existed by then. Yet someone inside the cockpit had still been trying to communicate. When the clip was forwarded to federal investigators, the response was immediate. Analysts confirmed the signal's frequency matched the aircraft's assigned radio channel. The transmission originated from the exact altitude Flight 417 had been flying at before it disappeared. But geographically, it didn't make sense. The source was over western Colorado, more than 500 miles beyond the plane's last known position, which meant only one thing. For at least 17 minutes after vanishing from radar, the aircraft had continued flying, blind, untracked, and completely invisible to the National Air Defense Network. Something had gone terribly wrong inside that cockpit. The investigation quietly shifted from search and rescue to something far more uncomfortable: human error. When federal analysts reconstructed the cockpit data entered just before the disappearance, one detail stood out. At 10:27 a.m., First Officer Rachel Hinton manually updated a navigation waypoint after receiving a routine reroute from air traffic control. But the reroute had been read aloud too quickly. 2 similar waypoint identifiers existed in the system. One belonged to the approved civilian airway. The other belonged to a restricted military navigation corridor. The difference between them was a single character. 1 keystroke. That mistake rerouted Flight 417 into an invisible corridor normally used for classified training exercises. Inside that corridor, standard civilian radar coverage was intentionally reduced. The pilots believed they were following a legal route. The ground controllers believed the plane was still inside a monitored zone. No alarm was triggered. No automated warning activated. And by the time a supervisor realized the aircraft had crossed into restricted navigation space, the handoff between monitoring systems had already failed. The plane had effectively slipped through a digital seam in America's air surveillance network. A seam no commercial aircraft was ever supposed to touch. Publicly, the FAA continued to describe the disappearance as unexplained. Privately, internal emails used a very different phrase: unauthorized airspace entry. The restricted corridor Flight 417 had entered did not appear on any civilian navigation charts. Even most military pilots were unaware of its full boundaries. Internally, the zone was referred to as Gray Route 12, a temporary surveillance corridor created for high-altitude defense testing and classified navigation calibration. What made Gray Route 12 dangerous wasn't the airspace itself. It was the technology operating inside it. According to sealed briefing documents reviewed later by a congressional subcommittee, the corridor was equipped with experimental signal interference systems designed to test how modern aircraft responded to degraded navigation environments. In simple terms, the system could selectively weaken GPS signals, radio navigation beacons, and secondary radar reflections. It was not designed to affect passenger aircraft. It was designed for unmanned platforms and military test flights. But when Flight 417 crossed the boundary, its navigation systems began losing reference data almost immediately. The autopilot didn't disengage. It compensated. It attempted to stabilize the aircraft using conflicting internal sensors. From the cockpit, nothing appeared dramatically wrong. The plane continued straight and level. But behind the scenes, the aircraft had become electronically isolated, unable to accurately transmit its position and unable to reliably receive external guidance. To the crew, it felt like a brief technical glitch. To the National Tracking Network, the aircraft had gone dark, and no one in the cockpit knew they were flying inside a system never meant for human passengers. By the end of 2013, Horizon Air Flight 417 was officially reclassified from an active search to a historical aviation loss. Memorial services were held across 5 states. Families received formal letters stating that recovery was no longer considered possible. But behind closed doors, a smaller investigation quietly continued. Every 6 months, analysts reran satellite sweeps and radar reconstruction models, searching for anything that might explain where the aircraft could have gone after entering Gray Route 12. Nothing ever appeared. Not even false echoes. Then, on the morning of July 3, 2023, a controller at Spokane International Airport noticed something impossible. An unidentified aircraft appeared on secondary radar, descending from high altitude without any registered flight plan. Its transponder code was outdated. The call sign was wrong, but the airframe profile matched a narrow-body commercial jet. When the controller attempted contact, there was no response. Still, the aircraft followed approach procedures perfectly. It aligned itself with the runway. It maintained stable airspeed. It responded to automated landing guidance. And at 6:42 a.m. local time, the plane touched down gently on U.S. soil. The registration number painted near the tail stopped everyone in the tower. It belonged to a jet that had vanished 10 years earlier. Horizon Air Flight 417 had come home. Airport security locked down the runway within seconds of the landing. Fire crews surrounded the aircraft. Federal agents were already on their way before the wheels had fully stopped turning. The cockpit windows were dark. No movement was visible inside the cabin. After multiple unanswered radio attempts, a tactical response team approached the front door. There was no sign of forced entry, no structural damage, no smoke. When the door was finally opened, the silence inside the cabin felt unnatural. Every passenger was still seated, seatbelts fastened, tray tables folded, personal bags resting under their feet. But the people themselves were gone. In their place were skeletal remains, perfectly aligned with the posture of living passengers. In the cockpit, Captain Derek Mallory and First Officer Rachel Hinton were still strapped into their seats, hands positioned near the controls. The aircraft showed no evidence of fire, explosive decompression, or violent struggle. Even more disturbing, the cabin temperature systems were still running. The plane was powered. It had flown itself to the runway. Medical examiners immediately noticed something else. There were no signs of trauma on the remains. No fractures. No defensive injuries. No evidence of rapid depressurization. Whatever had happened to everyone on board had not involved panic or chaos. It had happened quietly, and very likely all at once. Both flight recorders were recovered within minutes of securing the aircraft. Investigators expected massive data corruption. Instead, the cockpit voice recorder played almost perfectly. The final recorded conversation did not come from 2013. It came from nearly 4 hours into the flight, long after the aircraft should have reached the Pacific Northwest. Captain Mallory's voice sounded calm, almost relieved. "We've got it stable now." The first officer replied quietly, "I still can't see any ground references." The next 30 minutes of audio revealed something far more unsettling than panic. The crew believed they were flying inside an empty sky. No radio traffic. No navigation beacons. No visual landmarks. Just darkness beyond the windows and a star field that didn't match any chart in their manuals. The flight data recorder confirmed the aircraft maintained a steady cruise altitude for nearly 9.5 hours. Then the data became strangely repetitive. Altitude, heading, airspeed. The same sequence looping again and again, as if the plane had been trapped inside a closed guidance cycle. At the very end of the recording, a quiet automated system alert played. External reference unavailable. It repeated 27 times. Then the recorders stopped. When aerospace engineers analyzed the recovered flight computer, they uncovered a software behavior no civilian aircraft was supposed to have. Deep inside the navigation logic was a dormant contingency routine, originally designed for military testing environments. If an aircraft lost all trusted external references at once, the system would enter a self-preservation mode. In that mode, the computer stopped accepting new navigation inputs. No GPS, no radio beacons, no updated position data. Instead, it relied on a closed mathematical loop built from its last verified coordinates and internal motion sensors. It didn't try to find a destination. It only tried to stay stable. Level flight. Controlled airspeed. Minimal system changes. In short, the aircraft had been programmed to survive, not to land. Investigators now believe that when Flight 417 crossed into Gray Route 12 and its signals were disrupted, the flight computer misclassified the situation as a high-risk electronic attack scenario. The routine locked itself in. And more critically, it removed human authority over several core navigation layers. Captain Mallory and First Officer Hinton were still flying the aircraft. But the aircraft was no longer accepting where they told it to go. It simply maintained a self-contained flight solution, a sealed digital bubble. And for reasons engineers still can't fully explain, that loop continued running long after the people inside the cockpit could no longer survive. The plane kept flying, because the system had never received permission to stop. The official cause of death for everyone aboard Horizon Air Flight 417 was listed as environmental failure following prolonged electronic isolation. Behind that vague language was a far harsher reality. For nearly 10 hours, the aircraft remained at cruise altitude with no reliable external navigation and no approved descent corridor. The guidance system refused to accept manual overrides for route selection. Every attempt by the crew to exit the locked flight profile was silently rejected by the computer. But the real mistake came later. Internal reports confirmed that the experimental interference systems operating inside Gray Route 12 were never immediately shut down after the aircraft disappeared. They were scheduled to cycle off hours later. By then, Flight 417 was already electronically blind. Investigators concluded that cabin oxygen systems were never designed to support an indefinitely stabilized flight profile. The supply slowly degraded. Not suddenly, not violently, quietly. The crew and passengers would have lost consciousness long before any emergency alarms could override the locked navigation routine. The plane remained stable. The systems remained active. And when a long-dormant satellite tracking update finally re-established an external reference 10 years later, the autopilot accepted it instantly. It calculated a safe approach and brought a silent aircraft home. No criminal charges were ever filed. The corridor still exists. What makes the story of Horizon Air Flight 417 so disturbing isn't that technology failed. It's that it worked exactly as it was designed to. One rushed waypoint correction. One invisible military corridor. One automated routine that quietly removed human authority from the cockpit. And a system that never learned the difference between protecting an aircraft and protecting the people inside it. The families were never told about Gray Route 12. They were never told about the interference trials. They were never told that the flight computer had refused pilot commands. They were only told that the cause could not be publicly discussed. If you believe this story deserves real accountability, not classified footnotes, then help this case stay visible. Share this video. Comment your thoughts below. And subscribe for more deep dive investigations into the cases buried beneath official silence. Because the most dangerous mistakes aren't always explosive. Sometimes, they're written quietly into code. And if you think this can't happen again, remember this. That corridor is still active. And somewhere above the same American sky, another aircraft could cross the same invisible line.